you, everybody, for the invitation to be here. By a strange fortuity, a former colleague of mine, Father Rougeau at Gonzaga, had worked closely with Cardinal Martino, one of the, basically the author, or at least the chief editor of the compendium. And Cardinal Martino was invited to Gonzaga to, I forget whether he did our annual Red Mass or came to speak at graduation, but in any event, we had the honor of having him on campus, and Father Rougeau wanted a nice place to have dinner with him, so he asked if we would invite him to our home, which my wife and I were happy to do, except for the intimidating idea of entertaining this prince of the church. We had a delightful evening with this wonderfully humble as well as learned man. But it wasn't until this week that I began preparing for this conference that I actually sat down to read the compendium. So like someone was saying earlier, yeah, you know, I know this thing is out there. I think I know what it says, but I hadn't done the time to really educate myself. So it was quite an illumination for me, and I hope it will be part of what we're beginning today, that we actually spend the time with the compendium. My job this morning is to kind of give the big picture of what the compendium is all about and lay the foundation for the more specific talks later on, looking at such things as the family as one of the issues that the compendium addresses. So the compendium is, if I may, is designed to be somewhat like the catechism. It's sort of the owner's manual or the instruction manual, the reference manual for what the church teaches. And, well, why do you have two separate documents? Well, the focus of the catechism would be the theological doctrines of the Catholic Church. What about purgatory? What about the Immaculate Conception? What about the Trinity? What about all of these very deep, profound questions? And even as thick as the catechism is, it's still a concise summary of the very wide and complex teaching of the church. And while none of us, or well, I should say few of us, are called to be theologians per se, or even a catechist, we're all, as Christians, called to, as St. Peter tells us, when someone asks us for the reason for our hope, we're supposed to be able to give an answer. We're supposed to be able, to the extent of our gifts, be able to explain to someone why we believe what we believe, or perhaps more accurately, what we believe. And so, in a parallel way, when people ask, well, what does the church teach about just wage, or about when it's appropriate to go to war, or when it's, what we should be doing about punishing criminals, or what we should be doing about the immigration issue? What does the church teach about these things? We should be prepared to say, this is what the church teaches. So the compendium was put together as a kind of, just like the catechism was put together, to gather, not to write something new, but to gather what it might have been previously sort of scattered in lots of different places, in encyclicals, in conciliar documents, in writings of the great doctors of the church, to put these together in a usable form. And why is this particularly important for us? Well, I would make the argument, I'm getting to that age where my temptation is to recall the good old days. Well, boy, remember when things were so, orderly and good, and now they've all gone sideways. And I acknowledge that's part of getting old here. But I think they're, just as the expression, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not really out to get you. just because I'm getting old doesn't mean things haven't changed in a fairly significant way. That I would point to the talk that Robbie George, the Princeton professor, gave at the National Catholic Prayer Breakfast last spring, where he pointed out, gee, you know, once upon a time being Catholic, while it had certain awkward features, you were generally in sync with the cultural and political values of your society. It didn't put you sort of as an outcast. And I think to a disturbing extent, our culture has moved in such a way that the Catholic message about the calling of the individual person really does risk putting us in that position. He recalled the Protestant hymn that was that he grew up with in West Virginia, "The Old Rugged Cross," and how he was calling us to be willing to cling to that as the hymn goes. And that might mean something more than just the metaphorical or sort of individual spiritual thing. We may see a greater extent to which we do have to make sacrifices in order to be true to our faith. Now, at the same time, I think one of the places where we risk confusion is the distinction between what the church teaches as a general principle and how that might be applied in particular cases. Where has this church spoken authoritatively and basically put us under some duty of obedience to understand and accept the church's authority in some area? And where has the church laid out a general principle that has to be applied according to our prudential judgment in particular cases? One might think of, for example, the just war principle, where the church is clearly laid out. This is what it means for, you know, it is possible for a Christian to engage in war, but it has to be done under these circumstances. And whether those circumstances apply often requires what might be complex and fact-specific prudential judgment. So again, knowing what it is where we are asked as Christians to accept the church's authority and where the church puts us in the position of essentially as lay people applying the church's principles to a particular case. The sentencing of a criminal defendant might be another example of where there are general principles, but they have to be applied in particular cases. Okay, so I want to focus now specifically on the compendium and start with the a point that the compendium addresses particular audiences. The compendium addresses three different groups of people for whom the compendium was written. The first audience is bishops, clergy, teachers, those who are charged with explaining and evangelizing the church's teaching. And for those people, again, the compendium serves as a reference point, as a source of authority. Where there is confusion or there's some disagreement or limitation in understanding, the compendium is designed to help clarify and avoid misunderstanding. The second audience for whom the compendium was written was us lay faithful. That like the catechism is written in such a way. I have friends who came into the Catholic Church after sitting down with the catechism and reading it from page 1 to the end, because it's so accessible, it's so well written, it's so persuasive that it's not just written for theologians or for bishops. It's not some inside baseball thing. It's designed to be accessible to us, to help us understand what. And again, like the catechism, we're not all called to be apologists, but we should have some willingness to spend the time to be able to give an answer when questions arise. What does the church teach on these things? The third audience for whom the compendium is written is the mass of people not Catholic, but people of goodwill who look to the church for guidance. The church has a place in the world of respect in many quarters, that the church over the years has provided a balanced perspective. Even people that don't share the faith tradition may look to the church for guidance and clarity and balance on prickly social issues like just war, just wage, labor unions, immigration, etc. So again, it's designed so that you don't have to be a Catholic. You can look at the compendium simply as a well thought out plan for how to structure society. The other preliminary point I'd like to make before launching into these 4 principles would be to remember that the compendium is not written specifically for those of us who live on the west side, or even those of us who live in Washington State, or even those of us who live in the United States. It's written for people who live in Rwanda and Indonesia and China and Holland. This is so to the extent that we find something that doesn't seem quite apropos to our situation, we have to remember, oh yeah, this is a universal document. If I can use the analogy, if you had a weather expert who came to Seattle and talked about, gee, you know, there's such a thing as too much sunshine and you can get skin cancer and it can, you know, burn your, well, what are you talking, that's not our problem. And similarly, if you lived in Arizona and the weather expert talked about the danger of mold and how you could have, you know, seasonal affective disorder and, you know, too much rain was a bad, you know, boy, wait, this guy doesn't get it. So again, as you read the compendium, you have to remember that this is written across the generations and across the world, so that to the extent it doesn't seem tailor-made for our situation, that's because it wasn't designed to accomplish that goal. So, again, we need to remember that. The last thing I want to mention before launching into the 4 principles themselves is the emphasis that the compendium puts upon the unity of these 4 principles. We're not talking about sort of the 3 branches of government. We've got the legislative and the executive and the judiciary, and they sort of check and balance each other, and there's a compromise here, and you know, these are 4 different ways of really talking about the same thing. That's what the compendium wants to make clear, the unity of these 4 principles. They are not balanced against each other. Well, we got to do a little bit of this and a little bit of, no, they all work together, properly understood. They're not even in tension with each other. They are different ways of describing the same goal or the same vision. Okay, so what are these 4 principles? They are the dignity of the human person. That's the first principle. The second one is the common good. The third principle is subsidiarity. And the 4th principle is solidarity. So again, the dignity of the human person, the common good, subsidiarity, solidarity. Now let's take them again one at a time, but with the recognition that we're not dividing them as though they were really in separate compartments. Now, one of the things that I think is significant about starting with the dignity of the human person is to counteract the impression you might get from, I think, a popular understanding of the social doctrine of the church is that it's these sort of fuzzy-headed, warm-hearted, compassionate people who just, you know, are always banging us over the head about being too selfish, and why don't you give up your possessions and give them to other people? It's a sort of soak the rich, you know, lefty kind of social doctrine. We embrace our social justice. You hear the word social justice, and you may, ooh, gee, I'm not so sure I trust that perspective, because it doesn't seem to take into account the need for freedom and the risk. Again, you live in Arizona and somebody tells you about the danger of too much rain, and you're thinking, well, that's just not our situation. If you live in Washington State, speaking personally here, I'm more inclined to think we have too much government, that they're doing more than they really should. I want more freedom. I want more. And so, again, if I may indulge that sort of personal perspective from which I come, it's very important to recognize that the compendium starts with the dignity of the human person. This is not about taking away our individuality to somehow the greatest good for the greatest number, Jeremy Bentham kind of utilitarianism. The purpose of the social doctrine of the church is to emphasize the dignity of the human person, the individuality and uniqueness of every person. That's what we should be aiming for, and what the compendium calls the personalist principle. Again, that we are not in the wholesale business dealing with people as a mass at the expense of the individual. We are dealing with the promotion of the dignity of each individual person. Every person's existence is what the church calls a unique and unrepeatable being. The social order in its development, here I'm quoting again, must invariably work to the benefit of the human person, since the order of things is to be subordinate to the order of persons, not the other way around. So again, the social teaching begins with the affirmation that we are to be honored as individuals and as persons, not simply as an element or again quoting here, not simply as an element or a molecule within the social organism. So again, in sharp contrast to those ideologies or those political philosophies that tend to subordinate the individual to some larger mass, the purpose of this social doctrine is to emphasize the dignity of the human person. Now, at the same time, it's contrasted with those in what I might call individualistic philosophies that treat the individual as as a kind of billiard ball, separate being, and that society is a sort of necessary evil, or the government or social structures are a constraint on the individual that ought to be minimized to the extent possible. Because the human person was created in the image and likeness of God, we are meant to be social beings. In a healthy social order, we are not these little isolated monads, little individualized worlds. We are designed to be connected in communion with other people. It is, of course, the appearance of human sin in the created order that makes our relationships at times oppressive and exploitive, and from which individuals need to be protected. But at the same time, in its fulfillment, the human person experiences this communion with other people. Related to this is the connection, as the Catechism points out, as well as the compendium emphasizes, the relationship between freedom and truth. Freedom without truth, simply doing whatever you feel like, is not true freedom. It is a freedom guided by the truth, in which the human person is in appropriate relationship with other people. That's the goal we're headed toward. Another aspect of this is the recognition of natural law. Speaking as my day job is teaching at Gonzaga Law School, and natural law is not favored among modern, legal philosophers. It's regarded as some sort of, passé sort of thing. The compendium revives or recalls the value of understanding that there is a universal moral norm to which we are all in conscience called. As J. Budziszewski calls it in his book, it's the law we cannot not know. As St. Paul puts it in the letter to the Romans, this is the law written on the human heart. We all recognize this universal moral norm. Its practical application may require some discernment, and there may be legitimate differences about how to apply that, but at its heart, the universality of the moral universe, of moral norms, this is what, again, unites us as human beings in recognition of the truth. Again, as the compendium puts it, we are called to communion with others. The human person, quoting here, the human person is essentially a social being because God, who created humanity, willed it so. Again, the compendium looks to healthy relationships with other people rather than essentially limiting those kinds of relationships in the idea that somehow the human person wants to be let alone. The final point on the dignity of the human person is the concept of human rights. The church should take significant responsibility. Even the friend of many of ours, Father Spitzer, is quick to point out that the Jesuits deserve no small credit for introducing the idea of human rights to Western philosophy. And the church affirms the existence of human rights. But again, one of the potential points of confusion with the use of human rights as an idea is the tendency to limit or partialize the idea of human rights to assert some human rights at the expense of others. We know this most dramatically in the assertion of reproductive rights at the expense of the right to life of the unborn child. So while we affirm human rights, we insist, the church insists, that human rights be understood in their universality, that they apply to all people, not just some, my rights so that I get to exploit somebody else, but it's the universality of human rights. And the other concept is their indivisibility. Human rights indivisible with liberty and justice for all. Indivisibility of the human rights so that we don't pick and choose one right to trump another. Okay, that's the dignity of the human person. The second principle, and trust me, I won't take quite so long with the other principles. You're not going to be here for 3 hours. Principle number 2 is the common good. And again, there's a potential for us to misunderstand what the church means by the common good. When I was in college, one of the fashionable ideas was an essay by an early ecologist by the name of Garrett Hardin, and he wrote an essay called "The Tragedy of the Commons." And it was about how the grazing of animals in this common area, each individual doing what was in his self-interest, resulted in the destruction of the commons to the detriment of everybody. And it was basically the idea, okay, now we have to limit things like population so that we can preserve this commons. I want to say that's not what the compendium is talking about. The common good is not some limited pot of goods that we all have to sort of learn to take our fair share of. Rather, as the compendium describes it, the common good is the sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or as individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. So the common good is a set of conditions or principles, things that benefit all because they lead to again, they protect and ensure the dignity of the human person. They allow for human flourishing. What is a constituent element of this common good? It would be such a thing as a system of justice. Yeah, we have a legal system, but to what extent does that legal system fall short of a real system of justice? Wouldn't it be wonderful if we had a system of justice in which wrongs were addressed and compensated for, that legal rights were protected so that people could depend upon being able to transact business or to conduct their lives and be confident that justice would be done. Of course, we fall, as I could assure you, we fall very far short of that. It's, one set of rules for the rich, another set of rules for the poor, et cetera, et cetera. So again, the common good is this set of, again, to quote it, the sum total of social conditions which allow people either as groups or as individuals to reach their fulfillment, or to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. So again, the emphasis here is upon remembering that we share things in common. This is not a zero-sum game in which I can only achieve my fulfillment if I can be permitted to exploit you and limit your access to it, because if you get access to this, it's going to mean less for me. Again, just the opposite of what I started with as the sort of image that there's a limited pot of goods, or there's a limited set of resources, and we're all, elbowing each other out of the way. The common good is not that. The common good is this set of conditions, such things as having access to adequate health care that benefits everyone. It's in my interest that everyone have access to adequate health care, because the opposite, where some have and some don't, is to my detriment. It prevents me from achieving my fulfillment more fully and more easily. So again, I think we have to resist some of the sort of popular images that we live in a zero-sum game in which the fulfillment of one is at the expense of another. Rather, in a well-ordered society to which we strive, there is a common good. There is something where the benefit to another is a benefit to myself. Now, one of the things along this line is the compendium describes there's one of the topic headings is called the universal destination of goods. Universal destination of goods. I wasn't quite sure what to make of that phrase. That wasn't familiar to me. What do we mean by that? The compendium says, God destined the earth and all it contains for all men and all people, so that all created things would be shared fairly by all mankind under the guidance of justice tempered by charity. Well, that was the thought that flowed through my head. Gee, this sounds like, from each according to his needs, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. Well, in one sense, again, that we know from the moral teachings of the church, the parable of Lazarus and the rich man, and boy, do you not want to be in the position of the rich man who hogs it all for himself, and poor Lazarus dies of his wounds, and where do they wind up? The rich man is in torment, and Lazarus is in the bosom of Abraham. We don't want to be there. But again, what the church is teaching is not a sort of socialism here. Rather, that the ownership of property, while it is a good, the ownership of property needs to be balanced against the needs of the common good. So again, it is not in my interest, even as a rich person, that there be dire poverty. I need to remember that I will only live a healthy and fulfilling life if, as the compendium says, each person has access to the level of well-being necessary for his full development. That doesn't mean everybody has the same goods, but it means that I have to be responsible, and the political system has to be responsible to make sure that each person has a level of well-being, a level of, a level of well-being necessary for his full development. Again, remembering that the problems in Rwanda or in Indonesia or in the Ukraine may be quite different from what they are in Washington State, this principle, again, the universal destination of goods, is still part of the equation. At the same time, this very section of the compendium makes it clear that private property is a good. It's not a bad thing. It's not as though we should send all of our goods and all of our money to Olympia or to Washington, D.C. and have it be redistributed. Private property, I'm quoting here, private property is an essential element of an authentically social and democratic economic policy, and it is the guarantee of a correct social order. Without the existence of private property, we don't have the opportunity for creativity and for freedom. But again, how to balance that against the insurance that each person has access to that which they need for their fulfillment is important too. One of the things the compendium points to is this saying of Jesus, "You will always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me." Oh, that's a puzzling. Does that mean don't care about the poor, focus on Jesus because he's the, he's the scarce commodity here. Yeah, the poor we're always going to have. The compendium states this, again, a very balanced perspective. Christian realism, while appreciating on the one hand the praiseworthy efforts being made to defeat poverty, is cautious on the other hand regarding ideological positions and messianistic beliefs that sustain the illusion that it is possible to eliminate the problem of poverty completely from this world. This will happen only upon Christ's return, when he will be with us once more forever. In the meantime, the poor remain entrusted to us, and it is this responsibility on which we shall be judged at the end of time. So again, the balance between a responsibility toward the poor and the use of the poor as kind of a whipping point to coerce people beyond the point where it's really justified. Okay, principle 3, and I notice I'm getting near the end of my time here. Again, remember these principles are not in conflict with each other, but they harmonize with one another. So the principle 3 is subsidiarity. The compendium puts it this way, and I quote, "It is impossible to promote the dignity of the person without showing concern for the family, groups, associations, local territorial realities, in short, for that aggregate of economic, social, cultural, sports-oriented, recreational, professional, and political expressions to which people spontaneously give life and which make it possible for them to achieve effective social growth." So again, the social doctrine of the church points particularly at the desirability of promoting those institutions, family, church, school, soccer club, that are closest to us in our accessibility. So again, to the extent that you hear the social doctrine of the Catholic Church and it sounds like a plea to enhance the power of government, the principle of subsidiarity insists that we look first to those institutions closest to the individual, most likely to provide directly for the needs of the individual before we turn elsewhere. The compendium, quoting Vatican II, says, just as it is gravely wrong to take from individuals what they can accomplish by their own initiative and industry and give it to the community, so also it is an injustice and at the same time a grave evil and disturbance of right order to assign to a greater and higher association what lesser and subordinate organizations can do. For every social activity ought of its very nature to furnish help to the members of the body social and never destroy and absorb them. So again, the emphasis here is upon encouraging those local organizations. And even more bluntly, again quoting, the principle of subsidiarity is opposed to certain forms of centralization, bureaucratization, and welfare assistance, and to assistance and to the unjustified and excessive presence of the state in public mechanisms. By intervening directly in depriving society of its responsibility, the social assistance state leads to a loss of human energies and an inordinate increase in public agencies, which are dominated more by bureaucratic ways of thinking than by concern for serving their clients, and which are accompanied by an enormous increase in spending. Sounds like Fox News. Again, one of the dangers of the compendium is a kind of proof texting. You know, the way you pull something out of the Bible and say, see, it says right here, call no man father, huh? Well, you know, if you're taking things out of context and not seeing the whole picture, you can make some grave mistakes. So the last point about subsidiarity is the idea of participation. So again, we encourage not simply social structures that do good for people. We want social structures in which there is participation, in which the individual is part of their own fulfillment. And we're not simply doing for them, we are creating an environment in which they are participatory. Again, the underlying benefit of a principle of subsidiarity, that at the smallest levels, the family and so forth, there is a chance for participation rather than simply being a passive recipient of some good. The last point, you'll be relieved to know, principle 4, solidarity. And we all know that word from St. John Paul II's effort to free Poland from Soviet occupation. What was the basis of that movement? Was it tanks and guns and overwhelming military force? No, it was the solidarity of people who were unwilling anymore to put up with the lies of that Soviet regime. So again, as a principle of our social doctrine, it is the sense that we really are one. We are not separate interest groups vying for control. We are one people, one family, we are brothers and sisters in Christ. And on the one hand, this is kind of an obvious point. I mean, who would deny that? And yet, in our behavior, it is so easy to fall into the perception of us versus them. There's those of us who get it, and then there are those on the other side who don't get it. We're on the side of the angels, and then there are these other people out there, and we've got to outfox them we assume a kind of battle thinking. But the social doctrine of the Catholic church is based upon the idea we really are one family. This is a social principle as well as a moral virtue. Solidarity is, and I quote, a firm and persevering determination to commit oneself to the common good. And again, it is based upon the idea that we are living out the belief that we really are children of the one God, and that we are really brothers and sisters, and that we are willing to, as the example of our Lord gave us, we are willing to lay down our life for those sinners out there who don't get it, who don't understand what we're trying to do, who are busily trying to defeat us. Nonetheless, we have to exemplify a belief in a commitment to the solidarity of the human family. So again, these four principles: the dignity of the human person, the common good, subsidiarity, and solidarity. These are the different ways of expressing the same basic concept that the compendium is helping us to learn.